Ready? Welcome, everyone. Hello. Welcome to the November 4th joint meeting of the Facilities Committee and the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees. The two committee meeting jointly reviewed the financial statements for the university ending June 30th, 2021. Within the full audit report is an internal audit report that encompasses compliance and research. At this time, I will conduct a roll call attendance to determine if a quorum of the Finance and Facilities Committee members is present. Please clearly respond present when your name is called. Mike Fascitelli, present. Fahid Oshiwazi. Fahid, are you on? No. Christine Healy?
Present.
Matthew Lenz? No. David Moderano?
Present.
Susan Petrovis?
Present.
Thank you, Susan. Ahmed Sabatoni?
Present.
Thank you, Ahmed. Margot Cook?
Present.
Michael McNally?
Present.
Mark Palanch, I think present.
Present. Yep.
Present. The quorum is, I think here, quorum requires 6 members of the Finance Committee be physically present. I think we've achieved that, Michelle. So I'll turn it over, Ms. Edmonds for the report of institutional risk. Karina?
I am on. I did not get the report to report out today.
Did you get that?
Number 14. She says she doesn't have a report to report on.
I think we have to take a roll call of the Institutional Risk Committee, Karina. You haven't got the script, I can help you.
Okay, that'd be great because I don't have it.
Want me to help you out here?
Yes, that'd be great, Mike.
Can you tell me? So I'm going to, in place of Karina, ask if a quorum of the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee members is present. Please respond present when your name is called. Robbie Luna. No. Karina Edmonds.
Here.
Richard Humphrey. Neil Curley.
Present.
Christopher Bove. Tim Judas. No. Margot Cook.
Present.
Michael McNally.
Present.
And Mark Palanch.
Present.
Present. So a quorum requires 5 of the 9 members, Karina, and I believe that you qualify for that.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm going to then call the meeting to order. Make sure all members identify yourself when you make a motion or second if people are not on video. And the first order of business is acceptance of the agenda. I would just say here that motion that the Finance and Facilities Committee and Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the URI Board of Trustees accept the agenda for the meeting of November 4th, 2021.
David Moderano make a motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, just going to ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Any opposed? No, thank you. It's unanimous. So then the motion to accept the agenda is approved. The next thing is the minutes for the Finance Committee. So of the September 23rd, 2021. I'd like to get a motion to accept those minutes from a Finance Committee member. May I have a motion? Thank you, Christine. The Finance Facility Committee meetings are approved. Is there a second to that motion?
David Moderano second.
David, any discussion on that motion? There being no discussion, I ask for a voice vote, Finance Committee, Facilities Committee. All in favor?
Yes.
Yes. Any opposed? No. Okay, the motion to approve the minutes of the September 23rd, 2021 meeting is approved. Karina, there's also one of this for the Risk Committee. Do you have that? I want me to do that for you.
I don't have it yet. Apologies. Can you do that, Mike? Thank
I'll
you.
do it for you can catch up. So then, for the minutes, for the minutes of the 23rd Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee meeting, we need a motion for the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee meeting on September 23rd. May I have a motion to accept those minutes?
Motion to accept.
And second?
Second.
Any discussion? No discussion? Ask for a vote, all the members there, all in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? No. It's unanimous. The motion to approve the minutes of September 23rd, 2021 meeting of the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee is approved. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is item 3, which is the discussion item. We're going to get into the meeting. Discussions regarding the approval of the delegation authority thing, and I'm going to basically turn this over to Abigail Ryder for her to lead us through this.
Under the delegation of authority to the president to act in and on behalf of the board of property consistent with day-to-day management of the university. The president's responsibility for the general management of the property of the university under Rhode Island General Law 1632 2.1. The delegation requires that all action taken by the president pursuant to this delegation shall be reported to the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees at its next regularly scheduled meeting. As we had a number of personnel changes last year, this report has not been submitted since September of 2020. So what we have done in this report is report all the transactions that have been approved under presidential delegation since that time. Just in general, the nature of these approvals is very ministerial, is the way to say it. It's things like, easements for drainage, and we did a short-term rental in hotels. That one was actually less routine, but you were actually all aware of it at the time that it happened. And I think I can do either. I can go through each transaction and describe it slowly, or I can entertain questions if you have any questions about any transactions. What's your preference?
I think questions about everyone. Would anybody have any questions?
Happy to answer any questions.
So Abby, you go, these will be reported following.
At the following board meeting, assuming there are.
Yeah.
There aren't that many, so, but as they come up, then yes, we will report it.
Yeah,
And there's no action item. They don't take any action. This is just for information.
So you're aware of what the president is
Right.
approving during this application.
Okay. No questions on that. I think we turn to item. Abby, our facility discussion regarding the item overview of item B, which is the external audit report.
Thank you. Hi, it's my pleasure today to present the FY 2021 financial statements to the Finance and Facilities Committee, along with the required disclosures from our external auditors, which really are directed to the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee. Our auditors are with us today. It's David Eulis and Ryan Sheehan from the firm Connor and Drew, who have audited our statements for a number of years. And we've had, I think, a really excellent working relationship with that. When we consider everything in the context of the year we've been through, or the 18 months we've been through, I think you'll find that we've done very well. I'll give just a little background, as I did last year, about the difference between our financial statements and our budget, because they're really very different, and it's very difficult to do. You can't really do an intelligible crosswalk between the budget and the financial statements. It's very difficult to do. Cindy Mace may be the only person who ever did it. She's our interim controller and is sitting over there. But it's important to understand that the financial statements follow GASB, generally accepted accounting principles for government entities. And they include accrual accounting. So accrual accounting involves non-cash items like depreciation. You match revenues and expenses. So although you may have incurred expenses in the previous year, if they were generated some revenue, they move to where the revenue is and vice versa. You show interest in the expenses, but you do not show the current principal portion of long-term debt as an expense. That's done on the balance sheet. You classify capital maintenance expenses as increases to capital to assets rather than as an expense. But in our budget, we expense them first, and then when we're doing our financials, we move them to capital expense. The URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement and the URI Research Foundation are component units of the university, and they are included in our financial statements. And their financial statements include estimates of state employee retirement system pension and other post-employment benefit liabilities that are actuarially adjusted each year and allocated to the agencies by the state. So the result of that is that there are some fairly large numbers in our financial statements that you will never see in the budget. I think that's just an important thing to know. The budget is cash accounting and divides the budget into education in general, that is to say unrestricted funds, and auxiliary sponsored research and other, which are restricted funds. In our budget, we show the debt service on general obligation bonds of the state as revenue, and then we show a matching entry as an expense. But on our balance sheet, in our financial statements, those don't appear because they're actually obligations of the state of Rhode Island and not obligations of the university. Our revenues and the budget include the annual appropriation for the state crime lab. And everyone's always wondering why sometimes they see a number and it's about 1.2 or $1.3 million different from the number they saw last time. Almost always that's because the state crime lab is either included or not included in the number. Federal loans and external scholarships are included as revenue and expense in the budget, but the financial statements treat it as a pass-through. And operating expenses include maintenance items that are considered capital expenditures under GASB and so on. So I just wanted you to understand that the important thing is we manage to the budget. We don't manage the financial statements. But the financial statements are very important, for example, to our ability to issue revenue bonds, because debt service coverage for the purpose of issuing revenue bonds is based on a calculation from our financial statements. So they are important. This is sort of what I call the money slide. And I put 3 years on it this year because 2020 was, a very different year, and so was 2021. When we consider this overall, we really did quite well. And considering the context we were in, really very well. Our FY21 operating revenues of $448.9 million were down by about $5.41 million, or about 1.2% from FY20. We did have an increase in tuition of 3% for in-state students and 2.8% for out-of-state students. And that was partially offset, as is our practice, by an increase in financial aid of $7 million. There was a decrease in the number of students living on campus due to the pandemic and the fact that we were doing hybrid delivery of instruction. Some students took the opportunity to stay at home and save room and board, and therefore the residence on campus was lower. So housing revenues decreased by $7.9 million in FY21, or 21% compared to FY20, and dining revenue decreased by $4.6 million, or 26%. These two entities, housing, residential life, and dining services, were the two parts of the university most affected by the pandemic. Research expenditure reimbursements increased by nearly $9.5 million due to our increasing awards, and that compensated somewhat for the $12.7 million decline in other auxiliary revenue. That revenue is things like the Ryan Center, Boss Arena, parking, and other entities that weren't as active in FY21, obviously, as they had been in prior years. Operating expenses increased by 3.3% to 570.3 million in FY '21, again, due primarily to increased research expenditures. The revenue that we recognize for research is equal to the amount that we've expended because that money comes out of a grant and gets included in the university's revenues. And that it reflects the increased activity in research that the university is experiencing. And also the other large increase in operating expenses is due to extraordinary expenses because of the pandemic. Salary and benefits increased slightly because cost of living increases were deferred by several bargaining units in a really deeply appreciated act of solidarity with the university. And were also deferred for non-union, non-classified employees. This enabled us to avoid layoffs, unlike many other employers. We made an extraordinary effort to try to keep everyone in place, and we succeeded. Auxiliary expenses decreased by 5.5 million, due primarily to the closure of the conference center and the summer camps at Alton Jones campus. And that was because of the pandemic, obviously. And there was a reduction in the cost of goods sold for dining services who simply served fewer meals and therefore didn't buy as much food. Non-operating revenues increased 30.1% with a $33.7 million increase due to the student aid portion of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Funding, or HEERF funds. These are a direct pass-through grant to students and may not be used for any other purpose. But it was incredibly helpful to our students, obviously, and we do report it, but it's a straight pass-through to them. The state appropriation of 78.2 million was down slightly from the final state appropriation of 79.1 million in 2020. But it's important to note that the FY20 appropriation was reduced from 84.7 million to 79.1 million on June 15th, 2020. That is to say 15 days before the end of the fiscal year. And by the way, and not coincidentally, it was exactly equal to the amount of the first CARES grant of institutional funds that we received from the feds in June. So not an accident. The FY21 appropriation is essentially equal to the state appropriation for the university in FY 2007, although enrollment has increased by approximately 23 students since that time. So what this obviously tells us is that the amount of state support for Rhode Island students has declined, and we have had to make that up from other sources. RICAP funds decreased dramatically by about 18.5 million as a result of the reduction of RICAP for so-called asset protection that the state allocates us. They only allocated us and all the other state agencies 2.5 million in FY21 because the state anticipated that its rainy day fund would fall to a level that would prevent allocation of RICAP funds to the agencies of the state. The other reason that it declined so much was because we had had a special appropriation in FY 19 and 20 to help us with the first phase of the fine arts complex, the recladding of those buildings. So those two things meant there was a big reduction in RICAP. As a result of all these changes, and in spite of the decline in RICAP, we had strong capital gifts at over 5 million. And as a result of all this, we had a $6.4 million deficit before capital inflows. But because of the capital inflows, our net position increased to 585.9 million at the end of FY21. We're extremely grateful to the state legislature for allowing institutions of higher education to build contingency reserves, which enabled us to configure and deliver for our students a year of hybrid instruction even before we knew we would receive federal relief funding. And also, we're grateful to Congress for providing the relief necessary for us to weather the unexpected pandemic. But most of all, we're very grateful to the faculty, staff, and students of the university who made an extraordinary effort to keep the university open and to deliver a year of quality instruction under incredibly difficult circumstances. Now, I think before I move off this slide, if there are any questions about the actual financial numbers, maybe I should take them this time. Okay, so then next, As I said earlier, the financial statements are important to the financial markets and continue to be. Again, I won't even do this. And as I said, the budget is the financial management tool that we use and that the state uses and that you will see. Now, what I would like to do now is to ask David Eulis, principal of O'Connor and Drew, if he would come up and make the required disclosures that the external auditors make annually to the board. You can stay there, it's fine.
My name is David Eulis. I'm the firm, and I'm with Brian Sheehan. I'm an audit manager at O'Connor. And if you don't know who we are, we basically have a niche within the higher education institution arena. We probably audit over 40 institutions throughout New England. The Rhode Island system being one of them. We audit the Vermont system. We audit almost all the schools of public higher ed within the state of Massachusetts. We do some work in New Jersey. So this is one of our niche areas. We're very proud of what we've developed within the firm. Obviously, you have your financial statements in front of you. There's a due date at the state that we've met every year on September 30th. Last year, you pulled this board together and, the financial statements were already approved by the time you got the opportunity to look at them. And we discussed that last year. So this year, around September 30th, we had discussions with the Auditor General to see if we can push off finalizing it so you have the approval prior rather than the state. So they, although we don't make any changes, they let us basically put off the approval at September 30th so that you can actually include the statements as part of your responsibilities. We have required communications to go through. I'm going to go through probably 3/4 of it, and then I was going to turn it to Ryan, who's just going to give you a brief overview of some of the controls we tested during the course of the management. We basically started the audit planning in May and to wrap up through September. So it's a 3 or 4 month process to get to this point. So you all have the required communications, and I was just going to walk through the pages, not in detail, but kind of an overview. So the first page.
Can you hear me? Can you go to the main mic?
In accordance with auditing standards generally accepted in the United States of America, as well as government auditing. So if you were to look at your audit report within the financial statements, you'll see that there's a reference to government auditing standards. And what basically that means is we issue 2 reports within the statements, one on the financial statements and one on the internal control environment. So the last bullet here is probably the most important thing I'm going to say during this whole meeting. We did issue an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, which is the highest level of assurance that a CPA firm can attest to with the set of financials. The next page goes into that second report that's in the back of the financial statements is an internal control report. So when we're out here doing the audit, extensive testing on receipts, disbursements, payroll, student financial aid. Occasionally we'll hit other transaction cycles on a random basis. If we were to find anything in those cycle testings that was inconsistent with your accounting policies, this particular report would be expanded to reflect any weaknesses or deficiencies. So again, fortunately, you can see here in the middle of the slide, there were no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies within your internal control environment. So that says a lot about the institution, about your staff. Basically, we're given a clean set of books to audit. So both reports that we issue as a CPA firm were clean reports. The next slide, it goes on to talk about that we have a responsibility to communicate certain elements of our audit to you, which starts with the limited procedures that do apply to your required supplementary information, or RSI. And RSI basically is your management discussion analysis in the front of your financial statements. And the RSI relates to the pension and OPEB information in the back of the financial statements, purely unaudited, but we're required to just apply limited procedures to them to make sure that they're consistent with the audited financial statements. The next slide relates to the independent.
Mike a little bit closer.
Oh, sure, I'm sorry.
On the phone there, I can't hear that clearly.
How about now?
Please pull it in.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
You can start all over.
So far, we're good.
I hope I'm speaking loud enough anyway.
Thank you.
The next slide is on independence. So one of the elements that we have to communicate with you is the fact that we are independent in regards to the institution. We don't perform any bookkeeping services, consulting services, really anything that could potentially impair our independence. Really, our responsibilities under the audit engagement is to perform the audit, work with management, pulling together the financial statement, although they do like 99.9% of it. And the single audit, which relates to the R&D and the student financial aid, which we'll have done probably by the end of this month. So basically, it's the only single audit engagement that we're hired to perform. And we know with the slide that the services that we perform were basically guided by Cindy, and she was a integral part of our whole audit process. The next slide talks about management's responsibility. When you look at the audit report, it's a segment on management's responsibility, and there's a segment on auditor's responsibility. So within the management's responsibility, basically, their responsibility is to follow their accounting policies that they have in place. If there are any changes to those policies or any new pronouncements that we have to implement during the period, we're supposed to communicate that to you. Fortunately, we had a very quiet year this year as far as GASB pronouncements. Next year, not so much. But the existing policies that were in place did not change. So as far as accounting policies this year, nothing changed. As far as estimates, another aspect of our audit that we're supposed to communicate with you. The financials do contain estimates. It's not an exact science. We've outlined here some of those estimates that are contained on your financials. The most significant probably in the last two, the last one, I should say, the net pension and OPEB liabilities, which are carried on your books from the state of Rhode Island. Next slide is basically talks about significant transactions, although we didn't have to implement new pronouncements or anything, but this slide really, Abby mentioned this when she was doing her presentation, the CARES Act monies that came for the institution. So this particular slide shows you how much was awarded in total, and it's basically extracted from your financial statements. So the top part basically talks about how much was awarded to the institution under these three individual programs. And then we show how much was spent or recognized, I should not say spent, recognized, different, the accounting revenue recognition rules. So this particular year, you recognized 24 million of that 59 million that you were awarded. In FY20, I think you recognized maybe 4 million. So you have about 31 million, I believe, to carry forward to FY22, I believe. So that money is available between institutional aid and student aid for FY22. Then we talk about
David.
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. Interrupt.
I had some people some question. What is this chart on the right? Is that just bringing up the date to the right from June 30th?
Yes. Yeah.
But the institutional portion didn't change, but the student, is there any reason why they both didn't go up during that time?
Which column? Which one? Basically, the off to the right is how much was recognized since its inception, 28.8.
So not from June 30th on,
What's that?
not after June 30th.
No.
I thought it was.
No, this is as of off to the right is how much cumulatively you've recognized and heard on through 6/30/21.
And do we expect Abby or David this all to be kind of zeroed out to the 59 million by the end of our fiscal year 22?
That's the hope.
Okay,
Yes,
that,
there are funds involved. We are not able to draw down on the institutional portion until we have awarded the student direct aid.
right.
And enrollment is in the process of doing that right now. They anticipate that they'll probably have it all dispersed by, I think it was January or February of this year, and we will then draw down all the rest of the institutional funds. So, but just so that the board understands, we are we will be reimbursing ourselves for expenses that we've already incurred. In other words, this isn't money that we haven't spent already. We've spent it. But obviously, in terms of actually drawing the cash down, we'll be doing it later this year.
And just one last, we had this question with the finance committee, which is, everyone's trying to figure out what did this cost us and what did we get in? And some people thought it was a windfall. If you go back and just clarify that. Because this page,
It's a little bit busy, but
It is busy.
hopefully it will help. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, it's small, but here's the thing. If you look, there are two pots of money. There's institutional funds and over on the right, you'll see student aid. And what you see at the top is the amount of the total funds. And then what we spent to date. This is through September 30th. And so the result is that we've spent, whether it's eligible expenses, if the government gave us another 18.4, we would have enough receipts to absorb that money. So the point is that we received a lot of federal aid, about 722, but we spent it all and then 18.4 more on extraordinary government expenses. And there's one thing notice that with this, we're actually in a reasonable position because we have a good contingency reserve and because we received this.
It's just hard to reconcile those 2 pages. I think people,
Well, we're looking at two different dates. This slide is as of June 30th and whatever.
September.
okay,
Right, we
Okay.
took two different dates.
okay.
Oh, and here's another thing. The ARP money, will show up until FY 22. It's not in FY 22.
Is that the 14th? Is that the 14th?
This is from the first CARES Act all the way through today. And we're in a net deficit position relative to working on extraordinary expenses of 18.4 institutions. And again, you can see over here that for the student aid, this is what will be dispersed this year. And when that is dispersed, we'll be able to draw down our 15.5.
You may want to point out the 14 million that was passed through from the state
Right.
CRF funds,
Yes,
because that's not included in the charts.
Right.
correct. That's right. There was another 14 million that was like the direct
That's the one.
state.
The second column.
And that's the CRF money, right? And that was our direct award institution. It was part of the 1 billion that the state of Rhode Island received, and then they were sort of a sub-recipient of that 14 million.
I think when this is all tied up this year, we just like to report what came in, what went out, so we can see this with the same dates and all that, because this has been a little confusion, so.
You're absolutely right, and it's still changing because we just got word this week. We had put in requests to people for additional some of these expenses.
Right.
And we just heard this week that $2 million of reimbursement
Yeah.
for these expenses. So it is an evolving number and it will continue to evolve until we hit all the deadlines. State reimbursement.
Okay, you guys can go back to, I just wanted to clarify that.
No, there's no question there is confusion, especially when it's over a period of several fiscal year ends. So at the end of it all, you'll see cumulatively how much you're awarded and cumulatively how much you spent. Hopefully those two numbers match.
Yeah. Did you have anything else on your side? Or?
Yes, just a couple more slides that I want to go through. So the next slide just talks about management's the responsibility that charge risk and all the transactions of the institution are reflected within the financial statements within the proper time period. The next slide talks about communications with management. So as part of our responsibility, if we have disagreements with management or any complexities, we're supposed to inform you of those. And you can see here, thank God, we had no disagreements with management. We didn't have to consult with anybody for outside expertise, no major issues or difficulties, no audit adjustments or uncorrected misstatements. We did receive an engagement letter at the beginning of field work, and the date that you approve the statements will have a representation letter dated and signed. The next page just kind of reiterates the fact that you had no audit differences or no uncorrected misstatements. And then we talk about fraud. During the course of our engagement, we're not hired to find fraud, but we're hired obviously for that internal control report, extensive work in regards to internal control. So if there was anything in there that was inconsistent with your policies and procedures, we'd be looking at it further and communicating that to the next level of authority. And obviously, if you didn't hear from us during the course of the audit engagement, we didn't have any issues in relation to fraud. And then how I mentioned earlier, this year, we did not have to implement any GASB pronouncements, fortunately. But next year we do. We have this particular pronouncement that needs to be implemented, GASB 87, and it relates to operating leases. So if you have operating leases right now, they're purely a footnote disclosure within your financial statements. Going forward, starting next year, those operating leases would be reflected on your statement of net position as an asset as a right to use, and then liability with the net present value of the payment stream. So basically, your balance sheet will be grossed up on the asset and liability side to reflect any operating leases that you might have. And then with that, I was going to turn it over to Ryan. Ryan's just going to say a few words on some of the controls that we did test during the course of the audit. Go, Ryan.
Yes, so David said that we had a clean internal control report. These next couple of slides just kind of summarize what we did look at. So at the beginning of our audit, we plan out what the major internal control cycles are. So those are listed below: some cash receipts, disbursements, payroll, journal entries, and fixed assets. So we pick a sample.
Thank you.
So we would pick a sample of those and test those throughout the internal control cycle. The internal controls that we did look at are on the next slide. So what we look at is approval processes, timeliness, levels of review. All of those were good. We had no issues to report to the board. And we just noted that there were strong controls in place. Even when staff is on site or not on site, we didn't notice any issues with any type of levels of review or internal controls. Then the last slide is just one area that we know. I think it's most years it's the not having a formal fixed asset software. Not saying that you don't, or like the university doesn't track fixed assets. It is done. It's just not in a formal.
Where are we on that, Abby? You looking at a system on that? Can you give us a report?
We just started the implementation of a conversion of our enterprise ERP systems, which are finance, human resources, and student. We have to because, as I think I've mentioned, Oracle has announced that they're not going to support PeopleSoft after 2030. And therefore, we have to migrate. So we started the selection process. Carlos and I are heading that up. And when we do, one of the things that will be implemented is the asset management aspect of that software. What the practical implication of not having implemented the original PeopleSoft asset management software is that all of those adjustments I was describing at year end, where we take something that was expensed for budget purposes, but was a capital expenditure in accounting terms, we're moving those manually. It's a tedious process. It takes a lot of time, and it also means it makes it difficult to give a mid-year financial statement. We can do a mid-year progress against budget very easily, but progress against, in terms of our financial statements is more difficult. So that will be implemented as we go forward implementing the new ERP system.
The action item we're going to take as a finance and facilities committee is going to be to recommend approved audited statements to the board. So before we do that, I think we just open up the questions for Abby or David or Ryan, anything anybody wants.
I just have one thing, and I know what's written here, but as a board, I think we have an obligation to ask the auditors, have you experienced any undue influence to report anything here that you're uncomfortable with, or it may not be accurate?
Not at all. Not at all. And I wanted to close saying we wanted to thank staff, Abby and her staff. I mean, they're extremely cooperative. All the information that we have a perfect timetable as far as completing all the tasks that we need to do. September 30th is a tight turnaround time. And it's actually early than September 30th, because generally, I think by Labor Day, we're submitting draft financial statements to the Auditor General. Basically, they look at the financial statements along with the state controller, and then they come back and give us comments as far as, maybe some recommendations and reporting. But I mean, it's a tight turnaround, and the cooperation is amazing. The 7 books are great. I mean, as you saw, there were no uncorrected misstatements. There were no journal entries. So Abby and her staff should be very proud that the financial statements basically stand on their own.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Abby, you mentioned contingency funds and how much of the difference they made this year. To what extent were they depleted? I mean, where did the contingency funds stand now?
We have the nearly final reckoning overall for the institution. Our contingency funds at the end of the year were, I mean, and they're not just contingency, but what we call fund balance increased. I think, I don't have the exact number here. They went up, not down, but there are a lot of different buckets in there. So there's auxiliary fund balance and there's university fund balance and so on. But I think that on the whole, the E&G fund balance is very healthy. It's, I think, above $30 million. Some of that is already committed, to particular projects. And likewise, I think the auxiliaries suffered the most in terms of, because of lost revenue primarily. And then extraordinary expenses like renting hotels and so on to take care of the pandemic. But testing, a huge expense. We're hopeful that we are going to continue to get more reimbursement from FEMA, and that would presumably give the auxiliaries, the ability to put their fund balance back. So overall, we're in excellent shape considering where we could have been.
Yeah.
And we didn't have cash flow problems at any time. We had no cash flow difficulties. We have a big cash position, that starts in the fall, and we were able to manage that comfortably all year.
Thank you.
Yes, Chris, sir.
Thank you. I just have a quick question again in terms of our reserves. You brought up a good point about, we had to spend a lot of money on hotels. Obviously, while our numbers remain low, we do have situations where students on campus have to quarantine. Are we still paying for hotels, or how are we managing that this year?
We rented a hotel for this semester.
Okay.
And based on our experience so far and the really wonderful compliance that we're having with students, staff, faculty in terms of vaccination, or complying with our testing and masking requirements if they have an exemption. We have a very, very low positivity rate. And, I always feel that I should touch wood or something when I say this, but the experience today in the fall has been so good that we feel that we can handle any quarantine isolation needs of students in the second semester on campus.
Any other questions or comments for the auditors or Abby and stuff? No? Okay, then I think we'll move on to the action item, which is action item 4A, which is the review of the audited financial statements we just went through for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2021, and our recommendation to the Board of Trustees. So now, the Finance and Facilities Committee members vote on this. Is not for the Institutional Risk Committee. So I need a motion that the Finance and Facilities Committee of the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees recommend that the Board of Trustees approve the audited financial statements for the University of Rhode Island for the fiscal year 2021, recommended and just presented by both and the auditors. Is there a motion?
So move, David Monrano.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, voice vote. All in favor?
Yeah.
Yes.
Any opposed? No? Any abstentions? No? Thank you. So the motion is approved. Thank you. I have just one other action item, which is to adjourn, which is everyone's favorite one. So I make a motion to adjourn. A second?
David Monrano.
Second, thank you. Ask for a voice vote on this. All in favor of adjournment?
Yes.
Anybody opposed? No. Okay, no. Motion to adjourn is approved. The next upcoming meeting of the committee, even though the Board of Finance and Facility Committee and the Institutional Risk Committee, which will be accepted at that point, are scheduled to meet on January 20th, 2022. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Michelle, we're done.